Hi, everyone. I'm Donna Anderson, author of LoveFraud.com and host of the True Love Fraud Stories podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Mandy Friedman, a licensed professional clinical counselor, about a very important topic: guilt. In our most recent podcast episode, called "He Says He'll Kill Himself Because of Me," the abuser was always saying and doing things to make his wife feel guilty. Mandy will explain why this behavior is harmful and how to deal with it. Mandy owns Clermont Mental Health in Ohio. She and her staff of 13 therapists specialize in treating survivors of abuse, specifically narcissistic abuse at the hands of sociopaths, narcissists, and psychopaths. Here's our conversation. So, first of all, tell me a little bit about your background and your practice.
I am a licensed professional clinical counselor with a supervisory designation in the state of Ohio, and also licensed in Kentucky and in Indiana. We work hard to help people recover after, but we also help people who need direction during an abusive situation, where they want to know what's happening and why is it happening, and then giving them some sort of direction of where to go from here.
Okay. So, what then is your approach in helping survivors of abuse?
I like to focus on surviving as being recovery, because you think about the damage that this type of relationship can do within a person, not just in their finances, or their where they live, their housing. It affects every aspect of your life, including your brain. And we like to help people recover in a way that helps their brain recover and their nervous system recover. So we use approaches like motivational interviewing, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and we like to use a lot of self-care focus and helping people learn how to put their needs first. Often the targets of abuse are the types that will put themselves last and give everything of themselves. And that's really learning to swim against the stream. And when you learn how to switch that up and say, what do I need? What's best for me? So we use a reduction in codependent tendencies and an increase in boundary setting. But my favorite is psychoeducation. Because just like the woman in the story that we listened to, she wondered for a long time, what's going on, and how does this happen? And she even said, like, I couldn't think about anything else. I was really focused on this alone. And that's what a lot of the clients are saying when they walk in, is they want to know, how does this happen? And that's how I got here too, was asking those same questions. And now here we are.
Okay. So, you brought up the recent podcast, which is called "He Says He'll Kill Himself Because of Me." And in this podcast, the abuser, who I called Jonathan, which wasn't his real name, but he kept saying things that made the target, who I called Avery, which was a young woman in her 20s, he kept saying things that made her feel guilty. So, do you hear similar stories from your clients?
Absolutely. Abusers use guilt. It's a main form of currency in their world. So yes, we hear clients talking about how guilty they feel, and then long after, even during recovery, guilt is something that people wrestle with quite a bit.
So, can you describe what exactly is guilt?
Well, I think it's important to talk about shame versus guilt. And, with shame, we're left with a lot of shame after abuse. But what that is, it's a belief that I am broken, that there's something wrong with me. Innately, I am flawed. Guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. But for the purposes of manipulation, shame is the outcome, but guilt is the tool. And guilt is something that is supposed to regulate our behaviors and teach us right from wrong. It's supposed to, and shame similarly, it's supposed to be something that adds to our moral compass. But if you think about how there are some personalities that lack a moral compass, and then personalities that very much adhere to a moral compass, that means one of those individuals has less autonomy, mobility. They're more stuck in a way in terms of what their options are for navigating situations because they're adhering strictly to a moral compass. So guilt is something that's supposed to teach us right from wrong.
So then it does have some benefit in that context. It's how we learn to regulate ourselves is kind of through guilt. That's one of the mechanisms.
It's supposed to help us make better decisions and realize that, hey, you hurt someone or you caused a problem, and we should feel bad about that so that we can correct it. We can change behaviors. We can apologize. And so as a little kid, that's when we start to feel those guilty feelings initially. And usually it's our parents or a friend or a teacher, that scolds you because you did something wrong and makes you feel bad for doing it. And sometimes children need to feel guilty, and that's a good thing because it teaches them, hey, what I do affects other people, and I need to be aware of that. But I think with some personalities and in some settings, guilt is used in a way that is manipulative, not constructive. And if somebody already has a history of guilt being used as a manipulative tool, then fast forward in our adult life, we're more likely then to be susceptible and vulnerable to that tactic.
So then how can feeling guilt harm us?
Well, as we've heard in Avery's story, guilt is one of the things that kept her in an abusive circumstance. And if we don't know the difference between manipulative guilt and constructive guilt, it can make us sacrifice our own well-being to try to make up for the guilt feeling because I did something wrong, and so therefore I need to correct it.
So in your view, do antisocial psychopaths and narcissists intentionally try to make their targets feel guilty? And if so, why do they do that?
They absolutely do it intentionally. It's one of their favorite go-to tricks and tools that they use. They use guilt because it works. And you'll notice that they do little test runs early on to see how the person reacts or responds when they try to guilt them. And if they see that they got, a response that they desired, then that's going to be a tool that they use over and over again. But often they try to suss out early on if you're someone that is going to have that kind of reaction to the guilting tactic.
Do you think that antisocials, psychopaths, and narcissists feel guilt themselves?
No, I don't think they feel guilt in the way that we would feel guilt. I think they recognize when they have crossed the line, when they've gone too far, when there might be a consequence, when they might be outed, when they might be seen as a bad guy, because often one of their, most important personas that they're projecting is that they're a good person, and that's really important to them. So they wouldn't feel guilty necessarily, but they might want to rescue their persona. They might want to manage their presentation in a way that, hey, I'm not the bad guy here. So it might look like they feel guilty, but it's more just like, I've been caught, rather than, oh, I did a bad thing, I should feel bad about it. It's, oh no, people know, or I could be in trouble now, or my reputation is going to be affected.
Okay. So How can survivors figure out if the guilt they feel is appropriate?
It's funny because I have certain phrases and sayings that I say so frequently and so often that they just become sort of a regular phrase. And one of them that I say is that guilt is a red flag, period. If you're feeling guilty in a relationship and it's to the point where, you really feel awful about little things that in the back of your mind, are somewhat normal, but you're allowing this other person to shift your thinking on the topic. Actually, you might think, was that really that big of a deal? I guess it is to them, so I feel terrible. But there's something in your mind that says, this isn't actually something I really need to feel guilty over. But if you have that upbringing, like I said before, where this was something that was used and you haven't healed from those things, if your parents used that, they shamed you a lot and you haven't figured that out yet, you may not be able to discern, that this is guilt that you're supposed to have versus that you're not supposed to have. But what I'll say is, I'll read a list of terrible things that are things that you should feel guilty for. Have you done this? Have you done that? And they'll say, no, no, no. Okay. I, I cannot think of anything that you should be feeling guilty about. I'll help you try to find something if you want, but I'm not hearing anything that to me is like, okay, yeah, that's something we probably understand the guilty feeling for. So if you're feeling guilt, it is a red flag. And what it means is that there's one of two things happening. One is that you're being manipulated, you're being guilted, right? That it's someone doing it to you, or you're playing tapes, the old tapes in your mind that are shame-based thought patterns. And whether that's stuff from the past or stuff from the present, it's something that you're ruminating and you're mulling over in your own mind and you're guilting yourself. So it's a red flag, and it's either you're doing it to yourself because that's how you were taught, or someone is doing it to you. Because, Donna, you and I have heard these stories. You know what people are supposed to feel guilty for, and they don't. They sleep like a baby, no problems. And then you'll talk to your clients, or I'll talk to my clients, and these people are beating themselves up, just really in a brutal way, just trying to hold themselves accountable and teach themselves a lesson. And it's like they're their own inner abuser, using guilt and shame to just continue the abuse. And you and I might sit and think, boy, you didn't do anything wrong, and this is completely understandable. This person tricked you, they manipulated you, and then they use these weapons against you. They weaponized your good features of your personality, like that you care about doing the right thing for people and that you have a moral compass. It gets used against you. So when I'm talking about guilt to my clients, that's what I say, is that you have nothing to feel guilty for. I know why you feel guilty, but this is a red flag, and it means that you are being manipulated or have been manipulated.
So, when that happens, how do you advise survivors to cope with the feelings of guilt?
So first is that educational piece in discovering that these are patterns, and that it's something that happens to other people too. I think part of the shame and the guilt happens when we're really personalizing what's going on, and we don't know that they are skills and tactics used by manipulative, toxic, exploitative personalities. We think that, oh, this is me. So one way of coping is learning about your situation and figuring out that, wait a second, this person had intent to harm. They did this on purpose. So that's the first piece. The second piece is we need to go back in our histories. We need to see where this was used first in our lives and by whom, and really addressing that, and healing from those previous relational traumas. So if we don't face those, we will carry them with us, and then they will continually be something that surfaces in depressive thought patterns or depressive episodes. We will continue to make poor decisions in relationships because we don't see ourselves clearly. We'll continue to put our needs last because we won't feel good enough about ourselves to say, hey, this isn't right, or hey, this is what I need. So coping with the guilt has to do with you healing and facing the things that have harmed you in the past. And then we're going to need to learn how to forgive ourselves. And one of the things we really need to work on forgiving ourselves, and Avery dealt with this too, is we act differently in abusive relationships than we normally would act. And I call them countermeasures. So we hear about Avery smashing the goat head and then how horrible she felt about that afterwards. I also was in an abusive relationship with a psychopath, and I too did things that were out of character, and they were used against me. And I was told I was an abuser. You did this and you did that, and that was abusive. That was verbal abuse, and you threw this thing. And like, yeah, I did, but it was also reactive abuse. I was being poked and poked and poked and poked and poked. And after a while, you're just going to explode. You're going to do things to try to balance things out, to teach the person a lesson. Or my favorite is, I'll show you, I'll hurt me. And then that they can see how bad this hurts me. And so you behave in all kinds of ways. Some people have affairs. Some people neglect their children. Some people, participate in illegal things or sexual things that go against their morals. They do all kinds of things. And then later, we're going to feel guilty about that. And we're going to beat ourselves up for those things. And just like Avery did about the goat head, felt awful about it, even though all of us listening to the story were like, yeah, then set it on fire too, please.
Right. So then how do you suggest, once survivors realize that they're being manipulated, how do you deal with someone who is making them feel guilty?
You know, we talk about gray rock as being a strategy that people can use. And I feel like that part of guilt has to do with drawing you into a narrative, drawing you into a perception, and mischaracterizing you. You're being mischaracterized. And, Avery took that on as a challenge, as we often do. That's like, I'm going to prove to this person that I'm not who they're mischaracterizing me to be. But that's part of the trick, is to get you to prove them wrong. So with gray rock, what you're doing is you're resisting being drawn into those narratives. You're resisting getting into the back and forth of proving the person wrong. So if you're currently being guilted by someone, first we want to ask ourselves the question, where is this guilt really coming from? And are you perhaps defending yourself here? Are you doing something to balance this out? In other words, is this a countermeasure? Are you sure that what you're feeling guilty about isn't just a countermeasure of you reacting to your circumstance? So really examining where the guilt comes from the past and in the present, and then trying to retract or withdraw from those interactions where it continues to escalate in that direction. So for example, if he's saying to Avery, you're a cheater, you're cheating, oh, and you're gay, Avery may have risen to the defense and continue, that's not true, and here's what the real thing is, and I would never do that, and furthermore, now I'm going to prove myself. An interesting way to respond to that is, I never had considered that perspective, that you would believe I was cheating. I will consider that perspective, and I'll talk to my therapist about that. Would you like to speak to a therapist about what's happening? In other words, you don't engage in the conflict itself or in the accusation, but instead you say, I'm considering that. I'm not getting defensive. I don't agree with you. However, I'm willing to explore if we have facts here, right? Like we're going to try to have like a fact-based interaction. But truly, and Donna, you know, and I know that often the only thing you can do is get away from the person because they have a mental hold over you. It's a neurobiological hold over your brain, your thoughts, your nervous system. And you get triggered by this person, especially when you're being targeted and you're being accused of things. It does something to your nervous system where you are now triggered and you kind of don't have a lot of control over yourself in those moments. You'll notice that you feel out of control, that you don't have a say, you can't voice, you get into a freeze fawn, mode where you're just kind of shut down. And if that is what's happening to you, then that means that this person, you need to get away from them, and we need to give your nervous system a break from them for you to be able to see the situation more clearly. It might be really difficult for you to step outside of it and see it objectively while you're in the same room with the person who's been abusing you and hurting you. So there's ways to cope with it afterwards. There's ways to cope with it during, but because of the severity of the control that they have, you may not be able to overcome the guilt while you're still being abused by the person. And if you have that expectation that you're going to be able to just champion this in some way, and I'm just gonna not feel guilty, I'm just not gonna let those tactics get to me. That's just not how this works, unfortunately, because it doesn't have to do with willpower. It doesn't have to do with character. It has to do with how this person has affected your brain.
Wow. So, what's your advice for people keeping feelings of guilt in perspective?
I like to have a little list of things for people to keep with them that are fact-based things. That might be just the obvious antithesis of whatever the guilt accusation is. So, for example, you're selfish, and that's something that is an easy one for you, that somebody could call you selfish and then you're just automatically being manipulated. Okay, so that's a big problem for me is when I get called selfish, then I just give everything away and put myself last. Okay, so now I'm going to need to notice that this is happening. And that takes something just in itself to be able to notice that it's happening. And then from there, you have a list of 3 facts. One might be, my abusive father called me selfish during childhood. Number 2, when I am called selfish, I will surrender. I will subvert. I will commit. I will, so when I feel guilt, I do what? What is your go-to when you feel guilt? I drink. I get quiet. And that's a fact. So, that would be another thing on the list. What happens when you feel guilty? And then the third thing might be something like, I help people for a living. I'm a good person. I like to help people. I'm an empathic soul. I try to make the world a better place. But what I don't like to hear, but I hear a lot of, and maybe you do too, is this sort of like qualifying explanations that people will make. To me, for example, they'll say like, I did bad things too. I know I'm not perfect. Like they did do those things, but I also did this or that. And it's like, can we just not do that? We get it. Well, I know that you want your story to be precise because you want me to fully understand. So then that way the information I give you is accurate. So people like overly explain and want me to know, like, yeah, but I did cause this, or I hear you and I know why you're telling me that. I get it. But you just repeating that narrative over and over again, how you did things too, and how you contributed and you were part of it, just sustains that guilt narrative in your mind. How about instead, I was tricked? I was literally tricked into this. This person misrepresented who they are. They lied to me and they manipulated me. I was tricked. So if you have a list of these 3 sort of observable fact-based things, what that does to your brain when you're in a triggered, ruminating state of guilt or shame, that is actually based in the part of the brain where the amygdala is in your emotional centers. What we want is to get back into that cognitive, rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. So when you have a list that's fact-based, it helps your thinking move. Well, anyway, it helps you move to the part of the brain where you're thinking clearly, and that you're not in that sensing part of your brain where you just feel bad and you just have a sense of guilt and you're trying to make sense of this feeling that you're having. Read that list, and all of a sudden you'll be thinking a lot more clearly.
That's fabulous. That's a great explanation and a great technique that people can do. So, where can listeners find more information about you and your practice and some of the other services that you offer?
You can find our website, www.clermontmentalhealth.care. It's Clermont, Clermont. And on that website, you'll see all of our therapists and their profiles. All of them are trained to treat survivors of abuse, specifically narcissistic abuse. And they're also trained to work with clients that have complex PTSD. And we also offer SNAP coaching. SNAP is Survivors of Narcissistic and Abusive Personalities, which is a psychoeducational series geared to help people that have experienced abuse.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mandy. This is a fabulous conversation, and you have such great advice for all our listeners.
Thank you, Donna.
I'm Donna Anderson, and this is True Love Fraud Stories. I hope you enjoyed this interview with Mandy Friedman. For more information about the services provided by Mandy's Clermont Mental Health Group, please visit the page about this interview on podcasts.lovefraud.com. True Love Fraud Stories is produced by lovefraud.com. Engineering is by Terry Kelly. To learn how to recognize and recover from everyday sociopaths, visit lovefraud.com. You'll find articles, books, and webinars. You can also make an appointment with me, Donna Anderson, for advice on how to recover from your own personal experience with a disordered individual. Book your session today at lovefraud.com/talk to Donna. Also, I invite you to my Love Fraud Live YouTube show. I talk about how to spot, escape, and recover from sociopaths, and then I answer your questions. It streams live every Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. I look forward to seeing you there.